For years, I spent hours practicing scales and arpeggios, thinking if I just played the right notes, my solos would sound good. But now I know the truth. There's no such thing as right or wrong notes. Any note can sound good, even a note that doesn't fit the chord or scale, as long as you resolve it musically. Hey everybody, Jeff Schneider here. So in my last video, I went over these two ideas, approach note sequences and something I call the target note method. So say for example, you've got a C major 7 chord and you want to target the third of that chord, which is E. Instead of just playing the E right on it like that, you can approach it with an approach note sequence, something like this. That's a classic enclosure. You're wrapping the target note with notes from above and below to create this tension that resolves when you hit the chord tone. Now, after posting that last video, I noticed a bunch of comments asking if approach note sequences were the same thing as enclosures. And the answer is yes and no. Enclosures are a type of approach note sequence, like the one I just played. I'm enclosing that chord tone by playing notes above it, then below it, and then finally landing on the E. But here's the thing, not all approach note sequences have to enclose that target note. For instance, you could just play a few notes leading down chromatically toward the target without wrapping it. This is why I like to use the broader term approach note sequences. It's more flexible and covers more situations. But the core idea stays the same. You're creating movement and tension that resolves musically. What's great about all this is that it doesn't matter if the notes in the approach note sequence fit with the chord or scale. Even wrong notes can sound good if they resolve well. So that B flat there and that A flat, those are notes you certainly wouldn't expect to see in a C major 7 lick, but they sound fine here because eventually we resolve to that G. Again, you can get away with any note if you know how to make it make sense in the context of the greater line. Now, if this all feels a little overwhelming, don't worry. You don't have to start with long, complex approach note sequences. Try playing just a half step below the target note and resolving. So let's go back to E, the third of C major 7. Instead of just E, you could play E flat, then E. Or do the same for the 5. Now I'm going to play a short lick, this one right here. And I'm going to kick it off with that half step below approach note sequence. Let's do the same thing half step above. So you can see not only are we extending the lick, but we're adding even more interest to it. Now let's extend the approach note sequence so it's not just one note, but we're going to keep it simple still. So now instead of starting a half step below the target note, I'm going to start a whole step below and just ascend chromatically. Let's do the inversion of that now, starting a whole step above and going down chromatically. What's a whole step above E, by the way? It's F sharp. As you get the hang of this, you can move on to longer and more complex sequences, but keep in mind that not every combination of notes is going to sound great, like this for instance. Now that looks like an approach note sequence, but something sounds a little off. Check out this version though. I'm going to tweak it just a little bit. Instead of F, I'm going to play F sharp. Here's the original. Here's the modified with the F sharp. Now the reason why that F sharp sounds better than the F natural is beyond the scope of this video. My recommendation is simply to build up your vocabulary of approach note sequences by lifting them from books like the Charlie Parker Omnibook, or simply transcribing and analyzing licks from your favorite solos. I remember figuring out this Michael Brecker solo once and noticed a more modern approach note sequence that he uses. Check this one out. There's lots of different ways you can analyze this. You can look at it like whole step above the target, target note, half step above the target, half step below the target, and then the target note once again. But whatever way makes sense for you, however you want to organize those notes and intervals in your head, that's fine. The goal is simply to memorize the formula in whatever way makes sense to you so that you can apply it to all of the different chord tones. Now, one other detail I want you to keep in mind when you're analyzing these approach note sequences is this. So take, for instance, this one right here. It's a half step above, half step below, and then I'm landing on the target note. But is it that simple of an analysis? You can do it that way. You can think of it as a half step above, half step below, and then the target. And then if you were to repurpose that same formula on, say, targeting the 5, it would sound like this. That's a half step above G, half step below G, and then the G, the target note. But what if we're analyzing it like this? We'll go back to the original one here. What if this F here, what if instead of thinking of that as a half step, we think of it as a scale tone above the target note? When we apply that to targeting a G, we're not going to start on A flat, we're going to start a scale tone above the G. What's a scale tone above G? A. And then we go a half step below the G, and then the G. Now, whatever approach sequences and enclosures you choose to work on, start with a single chord and focus on targeting its main chord tones, the 1, 3, 5, and 7. For example, if we start a whole step above and go chromatically down, it'll sound like this. And if you want to get real fancy, you can experiment with targeting extensions like the sharp 11. Here's a longer line with that approach note sequence. All right, last but not least, if you really want to level up your solos as quickly as possible, I've got a great program for you. It's called the Soloing Bootcamp Bundle, and right now it's 80% off through Friday. It includes all of my best courses on improvisation, including the soloing system, making the changes, improvising with the blues scale without sounding like an amateur, and a whole lot more, all at a crazy discount that expires this Friday. So if you want to check that out, you can click the link somewhere on the screen or in the description below. And if you want another great video on how to improve your improvised solos, I highly recommend checking out this one right here. I'll see you over there, and thanks for watching. Bye-bye.